Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natalia Pavlik, and on behalf of Georgetown Interfaith Society, I'm delighted to welcome you all to our today's event and to our lecture with Professor José Casanova on global denominationalism and world religions. We are especially grateful to our partners for their collaboration, and we want to thank the Department of Theology and Religious Studies of Georgetown University, the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, the Graduate Student Government, and the Oriental Studies Circle. Thank you so much for helping us to organize this event and to make it happen. And a few quick notes before we begin. This event is photographed and video recorded, so if you prefer not to appear in the images, please let one of the organizers know so we can accommodate your needs. After the lecture, we will have a Q&A session, and afterward, we want to invite all of you to join us for a little reception in the foyer. Today's lecture invites us to think on one of the very important and timely questions. How do religions come to be recognized as distinct traditions in a globalized modern society? Dr. Casanova will help us reflect on how religious communities define themselves, how they relate to each other, and how they shape the broader context of religious pluralism today. It is a real pleasure to introduce Dr. José Casanova, whose scholarship has had a major impact on the study of sociology of religion, secularization, and religion in public life. As we know, his work has influenced scholars and students across many fields, and it's our pleasure to have you here with us today. Dr. José Casanova is an emeritus professor of sociology and theology at Georgetown University, and he is a senior fellow at the Berkley Center. His book, Public Religions in the Modern World, has become a modern classic and has been translated into many languages, including Japanese, Turkish, Spanish, and Arabic. Dr. Casanova was awarded the Theology Prize from the Salzburger Hochschulverein in recognition of his lifelong achievement in the field of theology. And on a personal note, I would like to add that Dr. Casanova's scholarship had a great impact on me years ago when I was a student in Ukraine. And also, due to him, I got to know about Georgetown, so I'm especially happy to be here today and moderate this event. So please join me in welcoming Professor Casanova.
Thank you so much, Natalia, for the invitation, and to the Interfaith Society. I would like to hear and to know a little more about this Interfaith Society, but maybe at the end you can tell us. It's a great honor to be here among friends and to be at Georgetown. Usually I don't give lectures at Georgetown. You give lectures at your home university, but somewhere else. So it's a pleasure to be here. It's the first time I'm in this room in my life, so it's also a great pleasure to be in Old North. And actually, I would like to chastise Natalia. I speak Ukrainian with her, so I can chastise her a bit. Well, the title was going to be Global Denominationalism and the Formation of a World System of Religion. So I'm going to tell a story of how this system emerged somehow. And then, of course, I would say, of course, it's very, for my vanity as an old man, to have such a beautiful picture is very nice. And certainly to say something which can never be true. Nobody is ever the world leading sociologist of anything. You have many, many people leading. But anyhow, thank you so much for this introduction. So I'm going to tell a story. The story of how the formation of a world system of religions, which I call global denominationalism, has emerged. So it's going to be a very simple story, obviously not exhaustive. First, I have to counter two other narratives that we have received lately, one the oldest one and the other more recently, which I think are problematic to understand how this system has emerged. The first one is, of course, the old Eurocentric, Western-centric, modern-centric theory of secularization. And this theory tells us that these religions are very old, primitive, and they are going to disappear with modernity. Obviously, something has happened in the process, and this is not true. On the contrary, we can say that with modernity, while in the West indeed, in Christianity in the West led to a radical secularization of European societies, in much of the rest of the world, this process of, people will call it modernization, I call it globalization, has led to really the formation of those things, those isms that we all use. Protestantism, Catholicism, these terms did not exist in the 18th century, nobody used them. It's not only Confucianism that was invented, and Hinduism, and Judaism, all of those terms came together at the end of the 18th, 19th century. So obviously this leads us to the other narrative. The narrative that basically, first, Europe is not the end, the teleology of the process of modernization, but I want to argue that against those people that say modernization brings religious pluralism, I would say no. In Europe, modernization came with the end of any type of religious pluralism, with the disappearance of religious pluralism until immigration has brought other religions to Europe in the last, let's say, 40 years. Before, there was only increasing secularization and less religious diversity throughout Europe. So the argument is that if we want to understand this process, we have to look to process of globalization. Namely, and the idea is, let's begin 1492, because 1492 is the beginning of two different roads. The road of internal European modern secularization, the formation of modern secular modernity, European, Eurocentric modernity. 1492 is the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain to form a homogeneous Catholic state, the confessionalization of the state, the confessionalization of the nation, that became the model for the Westphalian system, cuius regio eius religio. The sovereign determines the confession of its subjects. So the fact that each sovereign in Europe had the ability to basically determine which confession the subjects would have. So that you could create a homogeneous Protestant north, practically no Catholic left. So obviously the Catholics had to be either enforced to be converted to the new national religion, or they had to leave. And of course, a homogeneous European confessional south, in which again, practically no Protestants were left, and they either had to convert, were forced to convert, or they had to left. And then in between three biconfessional societies, Holland, the German lands, and Switzerland, but each of them with its own territorial separation of either the German lenders, they were either Protestant or Catholic usually, or the Swiss cantons. Each Swiss canton is either Protestant or Catholic. It's true that Switzerland is biconfessional, but the cantons themselves were not. They were either Catholic or Protestant. And of course, we know about the Dutch pillars, also Catholic and Protestant pillars, then a secular pillar added. So you have a model here where basically, first you have confessionalization through a state enforcement of a national religion, and then eventually secularization of the state, secularization of the nation, modern nationalism, practically at any point in which the sovereign is transformed from monarchic sovereignty to popular sovereignty, there is no change in the religious sphere. Even in France, where you have now freedom of religion for Protestants and Jews, but you don't find in the last 200 years any major transformation, groups, massive conversion from one group to another. Practically there is no movement from one religion to another. The only movement is people from one religion to secularization. And this is basically the story of secular European modernity. But 1492 is, of course, the beginning of the Western colonial expansion. And my argument is that this is what really is not modernity, is not Eurocentric modernization that tells us that history begins with the European modernity. But I would argue that before European modernity was formed, there was already a first phase of globalization before European hegemony. It's true that the New World was colonized by European powers, and people were also enforcing colonization. You know, basically, all the Americas, you have either Portuguese America, Catholic America, French Catholic America in the north, and all of them were part of this enforcement of royal patronage through which even Maryland came through a form of royal patronage given to Lord Baltimore the power to build this Catholic colony, and that's the way the Jesuits came here, and that's the way why we are here at Georgetown to a certain extent. This is part of the story. But the idea is when, and let's talk of the Jesuits, because part of the story is, if we are going to understand this process, the first, I would argue, pioneers, the first truly globalizers were the Jesuits, not those who came to America, because they came relatively late. When they came to, let's say, Latin America, the process of confessionalization, the process of evangelization had taken place. So in this respect, the Jesuits were not, other than Brazil, that you could say was established as a Jesuit colony, and to a certain extent, even Quebec, a Jesuit colony to a certain extent. But the point is, the Jesuits at the same time, before they came to America, they were already all over Africa, all over Asia, and it was there that the real interesting encounters took place. Because they came, yes, they came to Goa with Portuguese colonizers. They came to basically also Macau with Portuguese colonizers. They came to Nagasaki. But then from Macau to Beijing, they went on their own without any power, without any, and then from Nagasaki to Kyoto, the same, and from Goa all the way to, again, all over India and all the way to Tibet, the same. So you have here a model of encounters, I want to argue, religious encounters, intercultural encounters, from which the other narrative comes. The narrative that indeed all these categories are categories of modern secular reason. Even the title of the famous book by my colleague, and I admire the book very much, but this notion of Tomoko Masuzawa, the invention of world religions, or how European universalism was preserved in the language of pluralism. The notion of how these isms are really products of Western secular imposition. And even our religious studies came with the notion that religion is really an imposed Western category, we should get rid of it. I'm a sociologist, tell you it's too late. It's too late. You cannot get rid of these isms because they have been appropriated and made their own by the people, by ordinary people. It's not, maybe the isms were somehow established, as Tomoko shows, in Orientalist departments and libraries in European universities, but the fact is that these names somehow stuck. They were adopted by the people, and the encounters that led to these names were there before Western power. Let me just reflect upon how this very category of religion and secular culture emerges by simply pointing to Matteo Ricci in China, is probably the paradigmatic, if you wish, Jesuit that became first a Chinese himself, the idea that first we have to become Chinese before the gospel. So that our task is not to Portugalize or to Europeanize the Chinese, but to make the gospel Chinese, and first we have to become Chinese so you can help the gospel become Chinese. It was Balignano in Japan that started the process, and it was taken over then by all the other Jesuits, whether the Sideri in Tibet, whether Alexandre in Vietnam. Basically, the first serious encounters with the cultures and religions of Orient, of the East, came through this encounter with the Jesuits. They were the proto-Orientalists, proto-Tibetans, proto-Japanese, proto-Sinologists, proto-Sanskritists. If you look at the book by, what's his name, The Birth of Orientalism, the first list of the proto-Orientalists before Orientalism is established in the European universities. The proto-Orientalists of this group of 50 people, 40 are Jesuit names. In the history, I don't remember now. I should have taken the note and given you the title of the book, but let me simply move. Yes, as you know, there came a time within enculturation meant to basically adapt to a certain extent, accept the Chinese rights, as part of Chinese Catholics that could continue being Catholics by maintaining ancestral rights. This is only a portion of it. And obviously, Ricci did not come to these debates. The debates came after Ricci. But to understand how these debates came about, it is important how to see this. Let me read just, at least in Asia, it was an era of globalization, the first globalization before Western hegemony, let's say before the European democratic revolutions and before what has been called the birth of the modern war, roughly in the 1770s, when the American Revolution, the culmination of the French Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. So the previous era of first globalization encounters, it was one before Western hegemony. They went beyond Macau, Goa, Nagasaki, reaching places in the interior of India, Japan, China, Vietnam, and Tibet, where neither European merchants nor colonizers had access. In the process, they initiated a series of intercultural encounters that are for both East and West. The Jesuits were missionary proselytizers bringing what they call the new teaching of the Lord of Heaven. This was the name which Ricci gave to the catechism, with the first Chinese catechism, which they claimed to be the true religion. So they came with the categories of a true religion, Christianity, and the nomenclatura true means there are false religions. And the false religions themselves can be divided between schismatics, heretics, infidels, and then pagans and idolaters. What the Jesuits found in China, in Asia in general, that these categories didn't make sense. To put all the Asian religions as idolaters and pagan religions didn't make sense. So they were forced to think in new terms. And so, as such, as the new proselytizers, they enter in competition with the representatives of the East Asian teachings. But the Jesuits were simultaneously new proto-Orientalist observing scholars from the West who brought Western knowledge to the East and Eastern knowledge to the West. As such, they were received with an enormous curiosity as they engaged in intercultural exchanges and dialogue with East Asian scholars, but also South Asian and Southeast Asians later. It was this dual identity as missionaries and as scholars that made the Jesuits into pioneer globalizers during the first globalization. Other missionaries were not scholars in the same way, and other scholars were not missionaries. It was this fusion that really leads to this type of exchanges. The Jesuit encounter with the complex religious field they found in Asian societies forced them to rethink the classificatory categories of religion they had brought with them. Already in his early encounter with Confucian teachings, Matteo Ricci realized that the so-called literati, the Confucian scholars, which actually were called gentleman scholars, were human scholars. They were not Confucians. They didn't call them. In this respect, yes, the Jesuits found the name Confucianism. That's true. And the name Confucius, of course, is a Latin invention. But it's not. They did not manufacture Confucianism. Confucianism was there already, not as an ism, but there was a teaching that could be represented, that could be understood. So they realized that the literati did not believe in the immortality of the soul or in salvation in the afterlife, and did not practice idolatrous rituals, he says, other than thanksgiving to heaven and earth. Such teachings did not fit the category of pagan idolatrous religion. Indeed, they seem more like a proto-secular moral teaching, analogous to the moral teachings of ancient Greek and Latin classic authors, such as Socrates, Cicero, and Seneca, which Jesuits had incorporated into the Christian humanism they were spreading in Jesuit colleges throughout the world through their Ratio Studiorum. Saint Cicero, they call him. And Ricci said, if we can call Cicero saint, then I can tell you that Confucius is much a greater saint and much closer to Christian humanism, to revelation, than anything that the classic authors had. And towards the end of his life, in 1609, in a letter to Francesco Passio, the other letter was a letter to a Spanish administrator, grand administrator in the Philippines, where I get these notions, the first description of the literati, that they have no idolatrous rites, rituals, and so on, and that they do not believe in the immortality of the soul nor in salvation after life. Towards the end of his life, in 1609, letter to Francesco Passio, a fellow Jesuit in the Japan mission, Ricci wrote, "In ancient times, they, the Chinese, followed the natural law more faithfully than in our own countries. And 1500 years ago, around the time of Christ, these people were not inclined to the worship of idols. On the contrary, the books of the literati, which are the most ancient and authoritative among their writings, do not adore anything but heaven and earth and the Lord of both. And if we examine these books, we will find little therein against the light of reason, and much that is in conformity with it. And we can hope in divine mercy, and that many of their ancient saints were saved by their observance of the natural law with the help that God would have given them on account of their goodness." So in their encounters with the religious others, the Jesuits are confronted with forms of religious pluralism, which could not easily be fitted within the traditional taxonomies of false pagan or idolatrous religion and true religion. Moreover, in their recourse to natural law and the light of reason to account for the nature of this religious pluralism, the Jesuits initiate, in fact, a form of intercultural and interreligious encounter that takes place without reference to revelation. It's very important. When they argue with Buddhists, when they argue with Hindus, and they try to convince them that the immortality, the rebirth is a nonsensical category, they never appeal to the Bible. They only appeal to the reason they think they got from the Greeks. Greek rational thought, and they try to convince the Buddhists, and of course they're not convinced. And they are confronted with a different type of, what they thought was self-taken for granted anthropology. For the Asians was simply a completely different anthropology. This is not what we think that humans are. And no articulation of their rational thought could convince the others. So they came to the realization that we are dealing here with not competing revelations, but competing anthropologies and competing, if you wish, cosmologies. There. I don't know where I am now. I lost myself. I think here. Crucial was the distinction that the Jesuits introduced in China and in South India between religion and culture. Those components of culture which are not idolatrous, which are civil rather than religious, are neutral and therefore can become Christianized. This is the way in which Confucianism and Brahman teachings, as interpreted by the Jesuits, were understood not as an idolatrous religion, but as a humanist culture, as a morality based on natural law, and as a civil cult. The distinction between religion and culture was at the core of the Chinese and Malabar rites controversy. Other Catholic missionaries, Franciscans, Dominicans, the curial officers at the Propaganda Fide, but as well as the Jansenists and the rationalist Cartesian professors at the Sorbonne, rejected the Jesuit interpretation of the Chinese rites as cultural civic rites, insisting that they were idolatrous religious rituals which the Jesuits as well as Chinese Christians had to reject. So they really believed that the Jesuits were abandoning Western universalism, Western Christian humanist universalism, by compromising, by adjusting these distinctions. Unintentionally, however, once the distinction between religion and culture was incorporated into European debates, it signaled the beginning of the breakdown of the monotheistic distinction between true and false religion, on which the entire structure of the epistemologies of Western Christendom had been based. Later European philosophers, such as Voltaire, accepted the Jesuit distinction, but turned it against them and against Christianity and all rebel-faced religions. For them, indeed, Chinese Daist Confucian culture was clearly superior to European Christian culture. This explains in part the craze of the European Enlightenment and of deism for Chinese culture. Historically, with their final defeat in the rights controversy at the beginning of the 18th century, the Jesuit accommodating way of proceeding lost the battle within the Catholic Church, and I would say within the wider world and within European universalism. But in the process, they contributed unintendedly to the modern differentiation of religion and culture and to the pluralist global system of world religions that became slowly, progressively institutionalized in the 20th century. Let's say the beginning, you could say, the first is the Parliament of World Religions, you could say the first institutional manifestation of this, what I call beginning of global denominationalism. But in the 19th century, with the triumph of Western colonialism throughout Asia, the European attitude towards China and all Oriental civilizations radically changed. Now the hegemonic and technological superiority of industrial capitalism and political and economic liberalism demonstrated the superiority of modern Western civilization over traditional Asian cultures, these are traditions, and justified the imperial white man's burden and its mission civilisatrice. In turn, the technological superiority of Western civilization now confirmed the unique universality of Western Christianity. Here, the thesis of Tomoko Masuzawa is correct, but not in arguing that this itself is a production of this Western universalism that is imposed with 19th century colonialism. My argument is that in the same way we talk of a world capitalist system, you could say, but all these things already existed there before. Of course they existed before, but they had no name, they were different. In the same way, of course, there were economies everywhere in different types of economies before world capitalist system. But all the economies were transformed by the emergence of the world capitalist system. Of course, there were many types of polities, very different from the modern nation state. By the globalization of the Westphalian system through Western colonialism and the anti-colonial struggles has led to the globalization of the international system of nation states. My argument is, similarly, this process of intercultural, intercolonial exchanges, sometimes through conflict, sometimes violent domination, nonetheless leads to a process of formation of a global system of religion, which are called global denominationalism. You know, the name denominationalism comes, of course, from the American system of religious pluralism. Denomination is the name I give myself. Who are you? I'm a Baptist, I'm a Methodist, I'm a Presbyterian, eventually I'm a Catholic, eventually I'm a Jew, eventually I'm a Muslim. At first only is a category within Protestant denominations. And it's a way of mutual recognition. We recognize each other by the names we give ourselves. And the important thing is a process of recognition from below without a state intervention. As you know, the Constitution prohibits the American state to ask the citizens, what is your religion? So while citizens constantly ask each other, what is your religion, the state has no right. Even today, the Immigration Naturalization Service that has absolute power over every immigrant coming to America has not the right to ask them what is their religion. Even today, they cannot ask the question, what is your religion? It's unconstitutional. So it shows a new type of category. Now, denomination, you cannot translate into any European language. In Spain, denomination, you use 5 pesetas, 5 euros, 10 euros, 20. These are denominations. And when they translate it into European language, they translate either as church, or as sect, or confession, which are the three categories precisely of Western Christendom. Churches, the true church, then the schismatic sects, or heretic sects, and then, of course, confessions. The system has Lutheran confession, Anglican confession, Catholic confession, etc. So, but denomination is something altogether different. And my argument is that it is also the similar process of mutual recognition, not without the struggle, not without conflict, not without attempts at domination, one religion over another, that this slow process of global denominationalism is taking place. It's emerging. It's emerging, but I think it is a very important process that has to be taken seriously as a dynamic of globalization, as relevant, as important for the formation of a global humanity as global capitalism and the global international system of states. When you talk of the global capitalist system, we think of one system, one single system. There's only one capitalist system, which has internal divisions of exchange, unequal exchanges, certainly. Unequal exchanges between labor and capital, between center and periphery, but one system. And somehow we talk of the world capitalist system as one system. Of course, we recognize the Chinese version somehow sometimes doesn't look like the European. We can talk of multiple capitalism, but nonetheless, there is a world capitalist system that is one and to a certain extent homogeneous, while, however, differentiated by precisely logics of domination and power. Then you have the global international system of nation states, which is pluralistic, it's plural but not pluralistic. Every nation is basically a copy of the other. You have a model of the nation state that has become globalized and has been adopted by everybody. The problem with China today, with the Tibetan Buddhists and with the Uyghurs, this was a problem the Chinese empire didn't have. They have a way of accommodating this difference and making part of somehow of the Chinese empire. It is the Chinese nation with a model we have a nation state that cannot accommodate these differences. And so it is, each nation state is basically a copy of the others. They all have the same type of post office, the same type of sports, the same type of there is a whole polity. Sociology is the only social science that actually has a school of economic globalization, the world system theory, Wallerstein and others, sociology. You have the polity school of the Californian Stanford. They are how these uniform models of how to be a nation, national cultures, national economics, national statistics, everything has been globalized, and basically we have copies of each other. And I argue what makes the system of global denominationalism different is that it's not only plural, but pluralistic. What is unique is that each religion claims to be unique and different than affirming its particularism, while at the same time claiming to have something for universal humanity. And it is this dynamic, this tension between unique particularism of each religion, no religion wants to, this in the West we owe it to Judaism, the resistance against Christian universalism, to be incorporated into one single universalism. What the system of world religions tells us is that universalisms are plural. There is no a single universal, there are plural universalisms, and in tension and competition with one another. So it was, the sociologists of globalization, Roland Robertson, that defined the characteristic dual interrelated dynamic of universalization of the particular and particularization of the universal is the key to process of globalization. It's not homogeneization, it is globalization, simultaneously global and local, and simultaneously universalization through particularization, and particularization through universalization. It is these dynamics which are intrinsic to the system of global religions in a way in which is not neither to the capitalist system nor to the international system of states. So the process of constitution of a global system of religions can best be understood as a process of global religious denominationalism at the level of global civil society, whereby all the so-called world religions are redefined and transformed in contraposition through the secular, and thus comes secular reason and the global secular society. It is the globalization, the global system, it is a secular system. And the world religions have to accommodate this secular system. So the very category of religion is based on the binary distinction of religion and the secular. And this has become globalized. This is part, if you wish, of a Western model that was a typical Christian theological category, invented, if you wish, by St. Augustine. The seculum, of course, is a theological category. Is the time and space here and now, before the parousia, in which we Christians have to live together with the pagans in the Roman Empire for the common good of the city. This is what the seculum is for. It's not simply an aeon, let's say an indefinite period of time, but a particular theological conception that is based on this distinction between the seculum, or the city of God, and the city of man. So it is an original Christian theological category, but doesn't mean that it has imposed itself. It has been transformed. So what religion and secular means in any particular civilizational context, of course, is up for grabs, is contested. It means different things. It's not imposed by the West. It's not imposed by Christianity, as much as Christianity may have thought that they had the title, if you wish, to define what is secular and religion. So, through interrelated reciprocal process of particularistic differentiation, universalistic claims, that is very important. It's very important. We must understand, when Mama Lola, a voodoo priestess that became famous because an anthropologist wrote a book on her, and goes to television and sounds almost like Adorno in the Frankfurt School criticized instrumentalism, telling you Christians, you have destroyed our earth, and unless we change ourselves and bring some resacralization of the earth, we are doomed. So she has claims that the most, if you wish, primitive and pagan of religions, voodoo, has something to teach us Christians and Western secular moderns. So this claim that also, if you wish, the Amazonian indigenous, any indigenous group today, claims to have something to tell others. It's not only, so they are particularism, defend their particularism, but they also claim to have something of universal humanity, that they can also be a resource for universal humanity. So it is a interrelated reciprocal process of particularistic differentiation, universalistic claims, and then mutual recognition. This is the most difficult part, mutual recognition. But it's happening. It's happening. I mean, I'm here in front of me, my colleague can tell you about the G20 forums and all the world parliaments of religions he has visited and how this process takes place. At a certain level, this is already a fact. This institution of mutual recognition. When secular people say these religious people, they cannot talk to one another, it's impossible to have religious conversations. Actually today, it's secular rational people that cannot have normal conversations. It's a polarization. It's impossible to have any regular conversation on politics and anything. While you have religious people coming together all over the world all the time and having very serious discussions about what makes us human, how we should get together to come together to work towards the common good and so on. So actually you have much more mutual recognition today among religion groups. Not all of them. You have the other religious groups that actually do not talk to one another religiously, but they form alliances of moral majorities for political purposes. It's a different issue. Religion being the source of political alliances between religious groups that do not ever talk about religion with one another, never have interreligious dialogue, but they have very clear transactional political projects. Whether you call it Moralist International, between American evangelicals and Russian Orthodox, or between Catholic traditionalists and integralists and evangelicals. So this type of transactional, which is not mutual recognition between these religions. They do not recognize each other as equally or as true, simply a transactional relationship. So it's world religion. And I would say not only the ones we have adopted into our academic settings, but other new ones. from Baha'is to Falun Gong to basically Hare Krishna and to all these groups that basically view themselves as having a message for global humanity. So each world religion claims its universal right to be unique. So that's why the universalism of the particular, each particular religion claims its universal right to be unique and different, thus its particularism, while at the same time presenting itself globally as a universal path for all of humanity, or at least it has something to teach to humanity. Global denominationalism is emerging as a self-regulated system. This is very important. When the states get in, they screw up the process. It has to be mutual recognition from below, between groups. And of course, as long as religions have claims of domination and of superiority and of truth over others, it's very difficult to have these mutual recognitions. So a self-regulated system of religious pluralism and mutual recognition of religious groups in global civil society. We in the West, particularly in Europe, I would say, have failed to comprehend this dynamic because we have been functioning under the assumption of theories of modernization and secularization that presuppose that religion is an old, traditional phenomenon, characteristic of traditional societies, that is supposed to weaken with the advance of modern secular societies. Today, within the sciences of religion, of course, there is a new basic consensus that the differentiation of religion and the secular is a very modern phenomenon, that indeed the very generic concept of religion in the similar, with a plurality of forms, religious in the plural, only emerges in Europe slowly throughout the 17th century. When Ritchie goes to China and talks of the religiones of China, he means of the three religiones, namely what later will be called as Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, as religiones in the sense in which the religiones were the Dominicans, the Franciscans, those were the religiones of Christianity. The religious orders were the religiones in plural. It was not used for what we will call religions, to differentiate. And for he believes that Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism are simply three, if you wish, religious orders within the one single Chinese religion. And this is the model in which he is able to integrate. Of course, he thinks of these, the Confucians are the true ones, the others are... First, he thought that I'd be a Buddhist, and right, he came there dressed as a Buddhist until he realized that he will be laughed at by the literati, and then he became a literati. All the term isms that are used today to denominate most world religions, Catholicism, Protestantism, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism, Jainism, you name it, only attained their common use in the second half of the 18th century, and it is towards the end of the 19th century that the new nomenclature of religious pluralism begins to emerge, replacing the old nomenclature of true and false religion. The first meeting of the World Parliament of Religions during the 1892 Chicago World Fair represents symbolically the emergence of such incipient global denominationalism. The insistence of Muslims to denominate themselves as their religion as Islam and not Mohammedism or Mohammedanism, as they were called by every European language until very recently. And the fact that today we all call them Muslims and we call it Islam is a triumph of what I call the dynamics of denominationalism. We denominate them as they want to be denominated. And we denominate the people, we don't call them, let's say, whatever, Negros. We denominate them as they want to be denominated. And this model, process, is not only within religion, it's very much the process of mutual recognition between master and slave, between unequal people having to live together. And of course, the struggle for recognition is sometimes to death, because the slave wants to be recognized as a free man, but the master wants to be recognized as a lord. And there is possibility of a... So there are situations in which, indeed, if a religion insists on being the master religion, then the others are going to basically fight against it. But the question is, and there's violence, of course, in this process. These are not, the Hegelian process of mutual recognition between master and slave, or between unequal groups, of course, it's a violent process. But it is this dynamic of mutual recognition which is at the core of the global expansion of religious denominationalism, which today tends to incorporate many more recent historical religious groups such as Mormons, Sikhs, Baha'is, Falun Gong, Afro-American religions, Candomblé, Umbanda, Santeria, Voodoo, or the religions of indigenous groups all over the world, which insist on being recognized as equal religions with the others. Do not accept anymore the hierarchy that they are simply below. And of course, it's not recognized everywhere. When Pope Francis invited the indigenous Amazonian people to come to Rome and to bring their religious symbols, they are sacred, not religious, sacred symbols with them. And of course, they put them inside the church. And some Catholics thought that this is the fourth terrible form of pagan idolatry, and so they took the statues of their goddesses and threw them into the Tiber. So again, even within Catholicism, that of course has gone through the most dramatic transformation from being the most exclusivist of religions, claiming that extra ecclesia nulla salus, to become, if you wish, almost the pioneer today of interreligious dialogue and mutual recognition with all religions, from the highest, not only with Islam and all the Asian religions, but also with indigenous religions. So I think I'm going to stop here. It's by no means, it's the beginning of a process. But if we are going to have any future as a global humanity, we must recognize that we are irremediably multicultural, multilinguistic, multireligious. You say we have different anthropologies, different metaphysics of the cosmos, and we have to simply come to recognize each other, our humanity, even in these differences. And without it, we are doomed. So in this respect, I'm a little more hopeful of studying the world system of religions, despite all the conflicts, than sometimes of studying the world capitalist system or the world system of nation states, which simply are dooming us to disaster, both of them. Neither the world capitalist system nor the world system of states are able to respond to our huge challenges we face as a species and simply in this planet. So I think that in this respect, maybe all religions are ahead of the curve in many of these matters. So thank you so much. Okay, actually, these are the flowers that the daughter, a very beautiful young daughter of one of our students, had defended his dissertation on From World Christianity to World Islam. And again, this Department of Theology, a Catholic Department of Theology that incorporates a PhD program in religious pluralism, is the sign of this attempt that we do for mutual recognition encounters. And so these flowers, let's view them as a symbol of possibilities. Good, thank you.
Thank you.
I didn't take them because I am going to be traveling around, so I gave them to the Interfaith Society, and the Interfaith Society put them in front of us as a symbol of this encounter. So thank you so much. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Casanova, for this insightful lecture. And now we will open it for Q&A. Do we have any questions? Or I can start, and yes, then we will open the floor to everyone. Do you think that mutual recognition between different religious traditions is always a positive thing, or can it also be about some pressure to feed modern expectations?
Well, it depends. Again, it depends. It depends if it is true recognition of the other without precisely simply succumbing to whichever model the dominant other has over us. So again, but my faith is, my not only hope, but I'm convinced the dynamics of liberty, equality, and fraternity. After all, those are not liberty, equality, and the pursuit of happiness. This is more problematic when you are the pursuit of, but liberty, equality, and fraternity, that this is the kind of almost, you could say, goals upon which all religions I know can accept, but of course each of them will define what liberty, equality, and fraternity means in their own terms. Is, as you know, is gender equality. Of course, gender equality, when it was started in the 19th century as a project, meant something radically different. That, so the first feminist, then the second, the third, and we don't know. I mean, people saying today, you know, there's a lot of resistance to precisely this notion of gender equality, because a lot of people see it's an imposition of form of equality which comes from the West, and it's not our form of simply understanding us as males and females or other genders or whatever. So of course we are in the struggle for all these things, but my argument is, today the problem is not religious pluralism anymore. We've accepted religious pluralism. We've accepted it. Most religions accept religious pluralism today. Partly, of course, because religion was privatized and the secular state is the one that tries to... But the secular state had to come to terms with the fact that secularism itself is in question, that the secular reason is in question, that what does it mean a secular state means not imposition of any particular vision of who we are as a citizen and so on. So, but of course it is moral. It is moral pluralism which is the real question today. The real issue is, I mean, Durkheim, I'm a sociologist, and for Durkheim it's very clear. Each society can only have one public religion, he said. And of course, the public religions come and go, and there is a process of transition where the old gods are dying or dead, and the new gods are not yet born. But eventually, new gods will be born. The idea is you cannot have a single society with many competing gods. No, we know that this is possible today. Insofar as it's not doctrines that have rights but persons, and the right of individuals to seek truth. Not truth has rights, and not error has no rights, but individuals, all individuals have equal rights. And this in the field of religion is more and more accepted than in other fields. We do not accept it in the field of morality, sexual morality, gender morality. We do not accept it. Our societies are polarized today not by religion, but if we are going to have civil wars, it will not be about religion, it will be about this type of traditional family values, what we call Christian values. It has nothing to do with Christianity. It's a different type of how to get out of patriarchal inequality and so on. So it's not going to be easy, but we have no option.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. And now we are happy to take the questions from the audience. Please, we have a mic. Yeah. Please raise your hand and to speak to the mic.
And introduce yourself.
Yeah, introduce yourself and your affiliation.
Dear colleague.
Can you hear me okay? Do you think, I'm very interested about this mutual recognition that you're stressing as so essential to, do you think that you can trace that back to Ricci? The mutual recognition, or, I mean, what Ricci certainly had a form of recognition.
Yeah, of Confucianism, yeah, because so it's a kind of in the process of telling the Confucians, look, you don't even know your religion. I can tell you that the real Confucianism is the one that you have abandoned. So it is a Confucianism for the Lord of Heaven. Now you are atheists. You are let's say basically logical kind of nominalist, right? You have abandoned your old metaphysics. So I'm going to teach you the true religion. In the process, of course, there is a process of negotiation. He never negotiates like that with Buddhists or Taoists. And again, in India, we find the same. You negotiate with the Brahmins, but you don't negotiate with other forms of Hinduism and so on. So there is the beginning. My point is, it is not something that was intended. They would never intend to say that. We cannot say that they are proto-religious pluralists. They are not. They are not. But because they were willing, for the sake of bringing those teachings, they are willing to so much adjust themselves, enculturate themselves, and enter into serious dialogue. then this creates a process that they don't control. And it is, of course, and we know that it is not an invention of the Jesuits, this canny reason of the Jesuits that tell them how to do it. It is the Japanese Christians that tell them, you know, you have to wash yourselves. You have to eat like the Japanese. You have to become Japanese if you want to be taken seriously. The way you are simply Portuguese, you will never be able to sell Christianity. So in a certain sense, it is we know Ricci learned from the Confucian Christians, those who became Christians and created their own form of Christian Confucianism. So it was not Ricci that invented it. It was the very encounter. But it was an encounter free from domination and power, because Ricci had no power to impose. So if some Confucian converted, was because they found something interesting in this conversation.
This raises a very interesting question about, what Ricci and De Nobili and Valignano and so forth were doing was engaging in some kind of mutual respect for other cultures. For some of the other.
The Jesuits were very nasty in Ethiopia with the Copts. They were very nasty with the Eastern Christians, with the Orthodox. They were very nasty with the idolatrous people read the Inca and the Jesuits.
Okay, what I'm trying to say though is here there's a difference between the recognition of these other cultures and respect for them, and respect for the religion, because Ricci and De Nobili and Valignano wanted to bring Christianity to those people.
But what is true is that only when they come free of power and domination, they can assume this role. In Peru, and this is the story it's a fantastic story of this son of an Inca woman, a royal aristocratic Inca, married to a Spanish colonizer, and he becomes a Jesuit. But basically he wants to do with the Inca religion, the religion that he got from his mother, what precisely Ricci saw in China. And he's trying to say, no, these are not idolatrous pagan rituals. These are our respect for the sacred. And of course, they put him in jail. We don't know how he died. So the Jesuits cannot accept this. When a Jesuit, an Inca Jesuit, is trying to basically develop this same model for a dialogue and recognition of Inca religion, of sacred. So there is an essence in which these categories, where they are easy to be applied to pagan religion, idolatrous religion. So the Jesuits come there already after all this, the Inquisition has been incorporated, has been introduced, and these campaigns against idolatry are there, and they participate in those campaigns. In this context, there is possible recognition. It's simply domination and
But it raises the interesting question about recognition of religion and recognition of culture. They're not the same thing.
No. It was not. They were not ready to recognize the other religions, but in the process, by creating this distinction, that there is something in each religion that is humanistic culture, is our universalistic natural law, it's our simply in the light of reason. We share this. So they don't appeal to revelation because they are humanists, because they are Christian humanists. They appeal to natural law, so they can see it and they recognize. Ricci recognized they are better than we Christians are in accepting these natural norms. They are much better Christians, much better natural humanists than we are Christians. So they never question the superiority of Dominus Jesu. But they are convinced that Japanese culture and civilization is superior to European culture, despite the fact that they come from Italy, from the Italian Renaissance, which is, if you wish, the highest point of European culture. So for them, there is no question. That's why they sell Confucianism to the point in which all the feel, of course, they have much greater culture than you Christians. Of course. They take it.
There is another question behind.
Thank you very much. My name is Amy Stambach. I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and your work has informed mine tremendously, so it's really wonderful. Well, that's a long story. I can tell you later, but I want to give you my question. So I think the sign of a genius talk is when it's difficult to poke holes in it, because every time there was a hole, you sutured it. So I want to pose, since I work in East Africa, there's a real confluence of Islam and Christianity and also ancestral connections that people maintain. So I want to pose something that for you to react to. This seems like a very Judeo-Christian approach to the idea of denominational pluralism. And the reason I appreciated your remarks at the very end when you said Mohammedism is not acceptable to say. When I was young, we did say that, but that's not. It's an astute point that you make, that it's not acceptable. And so there's a kind of parity, but then also a hierarchy. Are you suggesting there's something fundamentally irreconcilable about that Islam, Judeo-Christian?
No. We just had this fantastic dissertation on an Iranian student who wrote this dissertation from world Christianity to world Islam, and begins with Casanova's theory of globalization of religion, and then ends, of course, with Peter Phan's engaging world Christianity, and say, well, maybe we can do something like the same way that within Christianity we've gone from this Eurocentric conception that Christianity is European to the recognition it was always plural, always multiple. There are multiple Christianities, there were always, and there will be always multiple Christianities. And then we can maybe use this as helpful to a way of reconsidering, redrawing also boundaries and so on within Islam, world Islam, right? That accepts. So the idea is, I'm not saying that Christianity should be the model, because even in this, for me, it was too much. And I would like to go, well, this is very easy. Between Christianity and Islam, actually, those are Abrahamic religions. They have the same God, so they are so close. Even Jesus, they veneer. And the Mother of God, they don't call it the Mother of God. But so they are so close. So this is almost small. Now, when you come to, as the Jesuits did, with Hindu and Buddhists talking about reincarnation of the soul, this touches the whole core of what to be a human and a person means. And they couldn't handle it. And the point is, they didn't find the answer, but we are grappling with these questions. When we say cultural accommodation, but to which point? The Jesuits were accommodating, but sometimes too accommodating. That's what the others told them precisely, the nobile. Well, you accommodate Brahmanism, but in the process you accommodate the whole caste system, and you abandon universal Christianity. We cannot have this type of caste Christianity. Or when the Jesuits in Brazil accommodate African slavery, and the Jesuits at Georgetown accommodate African slavery. Yeah, they were so accommodated, they became Marylands like the rest of Maryland's slave owners. So we are grappling with parts of cultural accommodation are permitted. We know with the whole debate, anthropologists, right, about genital mutilation. Can you accommodate it as a culture? Or is simply so much against the dignity of any human person? So this idea of what it is that we should and could and can accommodate, because it's culture in the sense that it is part of being human, is civic culture, and which go against the dignity of the human person, and therefore we cannot accommodate. And of course, even this, what means to be the dignity of the human person, we know that it changes. It changes all the time. For a sociologist, when I teach, I always taught all my life the classics of sociology, right? Marx, Tocqueville, Durkheim, Weber, and of course, all these white males, right? And you realize that they didn't see it. They didn't see it coming. Even Tocqueville, who argued democratization is providential, inevitable, it cannot be. And he saw that women in American democracy somehow were different from women in Europe. But he never saw it coming. Equality for him is the universal law that explains everything in history. And yet, he never saw gender equality. And of course, now we see it, but we see that gender equality is interpreted very differently. So the question, even when we agree on words, this one I say liberty, equality, fraternity, we are going to have a lot of debates about what liberty, how much liberty and equality are in radical tension with one another, and you cannot have a democracy that only has liberty but no equality, or only equality but no liberty, and so on. So the two democracies already talk about so very clearly. And then of course fraternity, which type of fraternity, right? How much are you willing to, I mean, the discussion even of Vance about the law of, how much can you love? You first have to love your family and your citizens, and then if something love is left, then you can love other persons which are not. So through the nations. So again, those issues are not resolved. We are dealing with them, but we are confronting the same problems they confronted, and at least without finding the solution, they really were able to accommodate and to find ways of dealing with these tensions, which are illustrative for us and are models of how not to copy what they did, good or bad. They also did things that they cannot expect them to do it. We cannot do it. We cannot have an idea of what, when I tell my sociological students, what you take for granted today, later will come the socialists tell you, people were stupid. They heard this is what being human means. So we simply have to be open to this humility of not knowing what these things mean, and being open to transformation of the meaning of all these concepts of equality and humanity and so on. And of course, we have to go beyond humanity today. With the Anthropocene, we have to go beyond humanity. Not transhumanism, I don't want this kind of transhumanism that makes us into machines, but one which incorporates the whole living world, nature, the earth, into our moral concerns.
Thank you. There is another question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Ilaria Macconi. I work for the Foundation for Religious Studies. We know each other from Villa Malta and Palermo, the European Academy of Religion. Bentornato, ben trovato. So I was very interested by your take on East Africa because I work for this academic foundation on a research program on Christianity and interreligious dialogue in East Africa, and I'm an historian. So my apologies, I do not know so much about anthropological, sociological view, but I studied the evangelization of East Africa, especially from a gender perspective, so female religious congregations. And one of the aspects I found the most interesting, you were talking about adaptation. So this is one of the most contested terms from African theologians, especially Jesuit African theologians. Most of you know Hekima College in Nairobi is one of the most important, actually, center for studying African Christianity, because the main problem was you cannot adapt Western Christianity to African culture. You have to let Christianity be inculturated in the African culture. So it was really a different concept of encounter and also historically, all the African theology. And afterwards, even in Christianity, the new forms of African instituted churches, Pentecostal movement that were born in Africa, especially in certain parts of Africa, this kind of innovation, you won't have it in other parts of the world. But just to let you know that I found your studies incredibly interesting, because also as we speak of Christianity, which is definitely very pluralistic in Africa, the same goes for Islam. Swahili Islam is a completely different formation from Islam, from the Arab world.
It's coming from the non-Western theologians, all of it.
Yes. So I just wanted to bring the African perspective
and
on
actually,
that.
had I known that you were here in Georgetown, we had with Peter Van today another session of our working group incorporating 3 papers that we will distribute to our group, because Professor Macconi is part of this working group. We have a project that we are, Jocelyn Cesari, also a fellow at the Berkley Center, expert on Islam, but now in Israel. We call it BTHEO, Theology and Practice of Religious Pluralism, within and among the Abrahamic traditions. And we call them Judaisms, Islams, Catholicisms, Orthodoxies, or Christian Orthodox, and Protestantism in the plural. So each of these traditions is plural. So the question is, pluralism is a problem today more frequently within the religious tradition, accepting this pluralism within, than sometimes pluralism or groups. Some groups can accept this mutual recognition at a certain level, while other groups are very much resisting it. Glad to see you, and you will receive, I was going to send an email next week to the whole group, sharing these papers. We had three fantastic papers on Brazil, and the kind of coalitions between traditional Catholics, integralists, and Pentecostals, and the kind of, and one on Peru, also fantastic, about what a theologian, a very interesting theologian from Harvard, a young theologian, has now called, using my name, reactionary denominationalism, which basically, again, was called by Father Spadaro ecumenism of hate, right? Basically, it has nothing to do with ecumenism, but it's simply the enemy of my enemy, is my friend, and so therefore, or sometimes called transactional conservative ecumenism, but it has nothing to do with ecumenism in interreligious dialogue. But they were two fantastic, and then a very good paper by, again, the fundamental issue of gender. We are dealing with this crucial issue that is the most, we have recognized, for me as a sociologist, it's very clear, is the most drastic, rapid, and fundamental moral transformation in the history of humanity in single 50 years. Nobody saw it coming. I mean, let's face it, 50 years ago, every authority, legal authority, religious authority, political authority, academic authority, psychiatry, everything, basically talk of, let's say, same-sex relations as a pathology, as a sin, as a whatever. So it was simply beyond the pale, not only within the churches, but within all our categories. And obviously, we cannot expect that a radical transformation like that can happen without conflicts. So we are dealing with a fundamental issue of transformation, of moral transformation of rural humanity, going to new categories of equality, and recognizing the diversity. And when then the reaction is gender ideology. So the very category of gender becomes ideological, of course. This is your own ideology. Now you are imposing on so-called gender ideology. So yes, those are very difficult issues. But what I learned from, again, it was not, they say, adaptation. They are the ones that, I mean, what we find the enculturation that is taken for granted after Vatican II, and that comes from everywhere, from all the non-Western cultures. But this, I argue, this is what they pioneered. And of course, we recognize that this method of accommodation, it was not adaptation, it was they that accommodated to this culture in order to be able to have this conversation. So I have a lot of respect for what they did. Let's face it, there you have Matteo Ricci, a young man that has finished these studies in the Gregorian, well, the Collegio Romano, well-trained in mathematics, in astronomy and so on, then goes to study theology in Coimbra, right? And there he gets the Jesuit humanist scholasticism. And then he becomes ordained as a priest in Goa, as he's there, so in the process. And then from Goa he goes to Macau, and there he encounters the older Jesuit, and they go together as Buddhists. And then he's on his own for 40 years, 30 years. And the fact that he's able to do this, becoming really a Chinese to the point that he knows the Chinese tradition, he can teach them. And the fact that he has learned the language in a way that he can read you a text and read it back. Chinese characters are not easy. And he could take a text, and he could, the Chinese themselves that admire this scholarship, realize that he was superior to them in this type of scholarship because of these techniques of memories. So anyhow, it's fantastic idea that you go there and you don't know if you don't use your language anymore. I mean, they use a kind of mixture of Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Latin, and so on. And of course, what made them is the fact that in the Chinese mission there were not so many Portuguese. They came through the benediction of Portugal as the powerful, but they were not Portuguese. You had in the mission, you had Germans, you had Belgians, you have Tiroler, you have basically Czechs, people that had no nation states, no colonialism, and therefore could become these universal Catholics without nation. Otherwise, it was for the Spaniards in the Spanish Empire, it was impossible to be this type of Jesuit. For the Portuguese in Brazil, it was impossible to be this type of Jesuit because they came with the colonial power of the nation state. And so it's a unique combination made it possible. Yes. Now, from the real expert, I dread the real question, the real.
Not at all. Brandon Dotson, Theology and Religious Studies. So you were talking about one nation state being a lot like another, being a copy of another. And then when we're looking at capital systems, you've got credit, you've got all of these different things we can point to. This fiat currency is like that fiat currency, can be converted very easily through xe.com or whatever you choose to use. So when you're talking about global denominationalism and a system of religions, can you elaborate a little bit on that? You mentioned uniqueness and you mentioned universalism. And at one point you hedged. You said, well, not quite universalism because not all of them are going to say that we apply it to everybody. You know, you talk about ethno-religions, for example, where that would be a counterexample. But you hedged, you said, well, at least they're going to say we can offer you something. We've got something to offer. Right. So besides those two things, uniqueness and universalism, what else is there? And is there a kind of homogenization in this global denominationalism such that they are convertible, that they are operating on a kind of baseline, perhaps dictated by nation states, by secularism, such that one can convert from one to another as an individual free agent? Going to where you were gesturing also in terms of humanism and going beyond humanism, is one of those assumptions about the individual, about personhood as being biologically bounded within flesh and blood, which might not be convertible to other notions of personhood that go beyond that in terms of different forces and souls and collectivities beyond the sort of Descartesian or Cartesian person.
Right. I mean, this is, of course, the real question. In my debates with Talal Assad, of course, the argument is that ultimately it's secular reason that forces all of them to become equal in the same. And I try to show, look, Catholicism defined itself and formed itself against Protestantism for 300 years and fought it in 19th century, tooth and nail, everything. The Jesuits that had been so accommodating up to the Enlightenment and that were themselves represent the Enlightenment, then suddenly comes the French Revolution, they become anti-revolutionary, anti-modern, anti-nationalist and so on. So there is this dynamic, it's there. And, but I argued, I am a son of Vatican II, the Catholic son of Vatican II. And of course, anybody can say, but this is the Protestantification of Catholicism. Of course. Accepting or at least adjourning, let's say, adjournament to the sign of the times. And with the bishops, but these are not Western bishops, they are bishops from all over the world. Precisely because there was a global mission before. Now, for the first time, you have the real first global gathering of humanity, I would argue, is the Catholic bishops from every country of the world, from every continent, spending 3 years together, trying to come to terms with which kind of age is our age, which kind of world are you, and they see the signs of the times. They don't call it globalization, but they say we are entering a completely new age of humanity. And so they see, but not because they are Westerners. My point is, and Catholicism remains Catholicism, all this has been radically transformed, but has been transformed in a recognizable Catholic way. And my point is, even when there is accommodation within all traditions, there is something, there is a continuity. There is not simply rupture. The notion of tradition and modernity. The tradition disappears and modernity takes over. This is kind of fantasy. I mean, I'm a socialist. Socialist is an ideology of Western modernity, is what it is. A theory of everything begins with Western modernity. And of course, it's an absurd notion. And the very conception of globalization, the theories we have is just simply the expansion of Western modernity to the rest of the globe. Nonsense. We are entering a new age that nobody knows where we are going. If any social scientist tells you, I know the future of global, nonsense. No of us knows. We are entering a completely new age. And this is what the bishops recognized, because they came from all over the world. All over, and they had to spend 3 years together discussing these matters. So it's a complicated matter, and it's local and global and local. It's glocal. Everything is glocal. Universal in particular are so interconnected. So the very notion of model of homogeneization is absurd. Even in even McDonaldization. Well, in Spain you could not sell McDonald's unless you sell beer and wine with it. So McDonald's in Spain have wine and beer. Of course, this is a very stupid thing, right? Or you cannot sell beef McDonald's, let's say hamburgers in India and so on. Yeah, but this form of even the most way of accommodating. There are negotiations with fundamental issues that remain. And obviously, you know more better than I am as an expert on Buddhism, how these things go. But I've been, every time I've had encounters when I go through Asia and discussing ecological issues with Buddhists and so on, you realize that, you know, it's not, obviously the impulse may come from the West, but it's taken in a Buddhist traditional form. In the way they can do it, they find it normal, their way of being Buddhist, right? And so you could say with many, many other things.
Do we have other questions? Back.
Hi, Benjamin Roth from I'm doing a PhD in the Theology and Religious Department. So there's this idea that how we define religion in the West is very much like faith or belief-based, and that's kind of a Protestant heritage.
I don't believe it. You know how many cities are called Santa Fe all over Latin America and the Philippines and Brazil? No city is called Santa Religion. You won't find any. They didn't even know what religion was. Faith was something very different from religion. Santa Fe, it was something, it was Santa Fe de Granada, and then you have Santa Fe's in every Latin American country, is a city called Santa Fe. In the Philippines, you have several cities called Santa Fe. So, no, this is a story of Protestantification, Glauben and the way Glauben, but even Glauben is not the same thing as religion. So the category of religion is a new category that only makes sense in contraposition with the secular. Not, I had these discussions when the theologian from Yale was doing the whole thing on globalization and religion, part of the Blair project, and he wanted to call it faith and globalization, precisely because of that. And I said, no, actually, the real category that we are using and everybody employs is religion. And this is the serious category that is new and has been globalized. Faith cannot be globalized in the same way.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's the correct category, but there is this idea that it is very much belief-based. But if you look at other religions or traditions, it's much more focused on ritual and or law, or just the way you live, right? And I was wondering, it does sound almost like when you talk about Matteo Ricci and his division of religion and culture, that culture part kind of sounds like the religion that's more ritual and the way of life. And no?
They don't know which category use. They use laws, because in Spain or in Italy, you distinguish the Jewish law, the Muslim law, and the Christian law. So they were everybody is safe according to their law. This was something every Spaniard would say in the 15th century. You are safe according to your law. Or in the East, they call teaching. So they begin to call it the teaching of the Lord of Heaven. In other places, it will be rituals. And so the civic rituals. So no, they are struggling with these names. They are not fixed categories. So Ricci doesn't use, when he uses religiones in the plural, he means the same way we have Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits, and we hate each other, and we could kill each other, the same way these guys have Confucians and Taoists and Buddhists. So they're struggling, they are trying to understand what is going on. Clear, all categories, true and false religion, and heretics, schismatics, and pagans doesn't work. This is for me what is important. They realize we are facing a new reality. We are encountering forms of humanity that cannot be put within our own nomenclature of true and false religion and the others. And this is the important. Now, of course, you go to India, and there is very clear for them who are the idolaters, right? So they are in India. Go against the heathens, and the whole literature becomes much more until the 19th century, and is linked to racism, is linked to other things. So again, those things, I'm not trying to in any way paint a nice picture. There is a lot of struggle for domination going on also in these categories. But we must recognize that this is a very, very messy story of how we have become a global humanity. And so we have to come to recognize that this is the way and somehow we realize that these principles of liberty, individual equality, and fraternity somehow have to find expression in each culture can find a resonance with these categories. And there is a recognition, of course, today by any serious philosopher that those categories come from secularization of Christian categories. It's very clear that fraternity is Christian agape. It doesn't come from the nation. So Christian agape transformed to the national body of the nation, not the body of Christ, but the body of the nation. So you can, of course, and you could do the same thing the way these categories of compassion will be transformed by Buddhism into something different and so on. But, and become modernized, right? The Protestantification of Hinduism, we have so many books about it. The Protestantification of Buddhism. Yeah, but it's not simply Protestantification, even if it was initiated by Western scholars becoming Hindus and Buddhists and so on.
Are there any other questions? Okay, so please join me in thanking Professor Casanova for...
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the flowers. Now somebody has to take these flowers home.